Hey guys, Danny here. So today we are going to be talking about kinetic forms and using the draw function, the draw loop in P5.js. So these are the functions that we're going to be talking about, functions and variables that we're going to be talking about today. So the function that we're going to be using today, the main one that we haven't used thus far in class, is the draw function at the top. So the draw function is basically just like an infinite loop that is constantly running through the code over and over and over again, versus setup, which is what we've been using for the first 7 weeks, is just it runs through that code once and then it's one and done. We're also going to be playing around with the frame rate function. We're going to play around with time functions. There's a function for milliseconds, hours, minutes, seconds, months, days, and years. There's a few variables that we're going to be using today as well. We're going to be talking about some global variables like display width and display height, window width, window height, and frame count. Then when it comes to movement, we're going to be using an updating equation for speed and the movement of an object on the canvas. So x equals x plus speed. That basically is going to update the position of x every single time we loop through the draw function. So it's going to move across the screen, in this case along the x-axis. Then we're going to talk about using classes and arrays when it comes to movement in the draw function. Cool. So the first thing we're going to look at is how to use the draw function and what it does. So again, it's basically just an infinite loop. It's just going to loop through whatever code we have inside the draw function. And we're going to put anything that doesn't need to be updated into the setup function, anything that doesn't need to be updated over time. If we're just running it once and we don't need to go back to it and update it, then that's going to stay in the setup function. All right, so let's play around with that a little bit first. So let's create our canvas. Let's do 600 by 400 for the canvas. Let's add a background as well. Just make it, let's make it white, 255. I'm going to do no stroke for everything. Again, that could be overridden if you wanted to. And then let's do a color mode for HSB. Okay. And let's just hit play. Make sure we got a canvas, everything is working okay. And then let's go to draw. So by default, when you create a new document in P5 in the editor, it's going to give you both setup and draw. We just haven't been using the draw function up until this point. So in draw, let's just add some elements. So I'm going to get rid of this background first because we want to be able to see everything, each frame. And let's just draw a bunch of ellipses first. I'm going to just do width and height divided by 2 for the location for now. And let's just do 40 by 40 pixels. Okay, cool. All right, hit play. Nothing's happening. Mainly because I think we don't have a fill, and it's just basically displaying as white. So let's do a red fill. Cool. So we have a ellipse in the center of our canvas. Okay. So not all that impressive, right? It's just one circle, or appears to be one circle in the center of the canvas. So why don't we do something so it moves position every single frame. So the easiest way to do that is just adding a random value for X and Y. and we could set that to be between 0 and width. But if it's going to start at 0, all we need to do is type in width for random. And then for y, let's do a random value for height, between 0 and height. So now if we play this, every single frame is going to randomly draw an ellipse in a random location on the canvas, but it's going to be constrained between the width and height of the canvas, so it's never going to go outside of the canvas. Cool. So we could play around with this a little bit more. Let's add some random values for the color too. Let's do 0 to 360. Nice. So we're getting a random color each time we run through this as well. Let's play around with the opacity. Remember, when you add a fourth value in fill, that value is a opacity value. And again, it's between 0 and 100. So let's do a random value, and let's make it between, let's add a minimum and a max. So let's do, like, I don't know, 20 and 60. Okay, that didn't work. Let's try 0. Okay. Let's try 1. Is it between 0 and 1? Okay, it looks like it's between 0 and 1. Let's do a random value between 0.2 and 0.5. There we go. Cool. So we're playing around with opacity, a random color, hue, and it's randomly positioning the ellipse, every single frame, in a different location on the canvas. All right, let's stop that. So again, the random function, or sorry, the draw function is basically just like an infinite for loop that's just going to go on forever and ever and ever until you stop the sketch. So what if we wanted to do something a little bit more advanced, like moving something across the screen from left to right, rather than just randomly positioning a circle on the screen? So this is what we're going to do next. So we're going to create a variable for our width, a variable for our height for a rectangle. And that's going to be kind of like our car moving across the screen. A variable for x, the x positioning of where that rectangle is going to start. And a variable for speed, so how fast that rectangle is going to move across the screen from left to right. In our setup, we're just going to have our create canvas again. Have a background color. I'm going to do no stroke again, and have a color mode for HSB. For draw, we're basically just going to add in a background color, and we're going to update the X position every single frame, so it's going to change based off the speed value. And then we're going to apply all these variables to the rectangle, and then at the end there's an if statement. For if the rectangle goes off the screen on the right, we're going to restart it all the way on the left. So it's just going to go from left to right and then start again once it gets to all the way to the end of the canvas. Cool. So let's go to that. So let's also play around with the background color in Draw. So as of right now, we don't have a background color or background being drawn in Draw. And that's why we could see all of these dots being drawn on the screen. So we're basically seeing every single frame, every single ellipse that's being drawn. If we didn't want to do that, if we just wanted to see one at a time, then we would add a background color. Let's just make it white again. Oh, sorry, this is HSB, so white would be see, hue, saturation would be 0, and brightness would be 100. Okay, let's see if that works. There we go. Cool. So now we're seeing every single ellipse individually. As you can see, or maybe you can't see on the video, but it's going really, really fast. So the frame rate is super fast. So it kind of looks like you're seeing maybe 6 at a time just because the frame rate's so fast and your eyes can't catch up to it. But it's only actually drawing one ellipse at a time. Let's see if we can change the frame rate just to, let's see, let's do 10. There we go. So if you use the frame rate function, you can change the total number of frames per second, essentially. Let's slow it down a little bit and do 5. So now you could see that, yes, indeed, there is one ellipse being drawn on the canvas at a time. And we are seeing that because we are drawing a background each time we run through this draw loop. So the background is basically covering up the last frame and the last ellipse. Cool. All right, let's stop that. Okay, so let's go ahead and set up our rectangle that's going to be basically driving across the screen from left to right. I'm going to comment out this frame rate too because we want it to be the default frame rate. So I'm going to create a variable at the top, W, and that's going to be set to 150. A variable for our height, which is H. Let's make that 75. A variable for X, which is let's set it as 0 for now. We'll come back to that. And then a variable for speed. Set that equal to, let's just do 3 for now, but obviously that can be changed if you wanted to go faster or slower. Okay. So now in draw, we want to have a background here because we don't want to see every single frame, every single rectangle being drawn. We just want to see the last one. So let's set X to be equal to X plus speed initially. So it's basically saying, okay, initially X is 0, right? But as we loop through this every single time, we're going to update the value of X to be X plus speed. So if X is 0 initially and speed is 3, then the second go around, X will be 3. And then the next go around, X will be 3 plus speed, which will be 6. And then 6 plus speed is 9, etc., etc. Let's add a fill for our rectangle. And let's make it black. And then let's add our rectangle. And then apply the X value, the X variable value. And let's just put this in the middle. So let's do height divided by 2. And then I'm going to do subtract H divided by 2. Since a rectangle is drawn from the upper left-hand corner down, we basically want to move it up so it's actually centered in the middle. And then the width is going to be just W, which we defined at the top as being 150. And the height is going to be H, which again we defined at the top as being 75. Okay, so let's just play that now. It's good to just run the sketch frequently so you know you don't have any errors. Okay, cool. So we have our rectangle that's being drawn across the screen and moving across the screen. But for some reason, it's not coming back. And that reason is because we haven't asked it to come back. We're basically saying, okay, start at 0 for the x, and then moved from the left to the right and indefinitely. Just keep on moving from the left to the right. So if we wanted to change that, then we basically want to add an if statement. So let's say if x is greater than width, then x equals 0. So that's basically saying when x is greater than width, or when the rectangle is off the screen completely, we want to reset x to go back to its original position, which was 0. So let's try and run that. Cool. So once it goes off the screen, it pops back onto the screen on the left-hand side. All right. So it's not very fluid though, right? It's just kind of going to the right, left, and to the right, but it's just popping back on the screen. It's not gradually coming onto the screen from the left. So to do that, we can fix that by saying, okay, instead of setting x to be 0, let's say x is negative w, which is negative the width of the rectangle, which is negative 150. And then we have to also update our if statement at the bottom, say, okay, when x goes all the way to the right-hand side, we can reset x to be equal to negative w instead of 0. So let's play that, and now it's nice and smooth coming from the left and onto the screen, rather than just popping onto the screen at 0. Cool. All right. So we got our rectangle moving across the screen. Next, let's play around with bouncing. So basically what we want to do here is draw an ellipse, and we're going to have that ellipse come from the top down and bounce on the bottom of the canvas. So we're basically going to create our variables at the top. D is the diameter of the ellipse. Y is going to be d divided by 2. And then we're going to have a speed, and let's set that equal to 10. Again, the setup is going to be the same. The only thing that we're going to change is the stuff in draw. So it should look something like that, where it's coming from the top down, bouncing, and then coming back up, and then bouncing from the top. So it's going to bounce back and forth, up and down. Okay, so I'm going to start over. Feel free to create a new sketch if you want to, but I'm just going to start from scratch. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is create variables. So var d equals 100. That's our diameter. Var y, which is the y position, equals d divided by 2, which is the diameter divided by 2. And var speed, it's going to be equal to 10 this time. Again, that can be changed. So if you want to go faster, you increase the number. If you want to go slower, you decrease the number. Again, I'm just keeping everything in the setup the same. Canvas is the same, background color, stroke, and the color mode is still going to be HSB. Okay, so we have our background. We definitely want to have our background on so we don't see every single frame and every single ellipse being drawn. And the first thing I want to do is draw the ellipse. We're going to do width divided by 2 for the x position. We're just going to draw it in the center first. Then the y position is going to be y, which is the variable at the top. And then the diameter, the size of the ellipse, is going to be using the variable at the top, d, for both the width and height. So after that, we're going to do the same thing we did before by updating the, in this case, a y variable. Before we were doing x, this time we're going to be doing y. So y equals y plus speed. Okay. So let's just run that real quick and see what we're getting. Okay, nothing. So I also need a fill. Don't die. So let's make it black, which is all 0. So we can do that, or we could just have one value and it should apply to all of them. Okay, cool. All right, so now we have a ball, an ellipse, coming from the top and going down to the bottom. But again, just like before, with the rectangle, once it goes off the canvas, it doesn't come back on. So to fix that, we basically just need to add another if statement. So let's add an if statement at the top. And in this, we're going to ask a question. We're going to ask 2 questions, actually. So we're going to ask to see if y is greater than height minus d divided by 2, or if y is less than d divided by 2. So d divided by 2 is basically just saying when the top or the bottom of the ball hits the top or the bottom of the canvas, then we're going to go the other direction. So rather than saying like just height or 0, we want it to bounce from the top of the ball or the bottom rather than bouncing from the center. Okay, so in this, we are going to change the speed. So we're going to say, okay, speed is going to be equal to speed, and then we're going to multiply it by -1. So basically what this is going to do is once it hits the bottom, speed is going to be a negative value, so then it's going to go the opposite direction. Once it hits the top, then speed is going to be a positive value, and it's going to go the opposite direction and go back down. Or hopefully. Let's see if it works. Hey, nice. So the if statement is basically allowing the ball to bounce from the bottom to go back to the top, and vice versa. Again, if you want to change the speed, if you want to make it slower, we can make this 5, and then it'll bounce and move slower. If you want to make it faster, let's try 15, then it'll go faster. Cool. Okay. So the next thing we're going to be playing around with is gravity. So we can create our own kind of fake gravity in P5 by updating the speed based off of a decimal point, like 0.2. So here, again, we're going to create some variables for s is going to be equal to our size of our object. In this case, it's going to be a rectangle. Y is going to be equal to s divided by 2, size divided by 2. Then we have a speed equal to 5, and our gravity is going to be equal to 0.2. In setup, we have our canvas, our background. For this, we're going to do rect mode center. So our rectangle is being drawn from the center out rather than, by default, it's drawn from the left-hand corner down. And then I just like having no stroke on there, personally, just because it's cleaner. And then in our draw function, we are going to be drawing our background, or updating our speed, updating our y based off of the speed, and then having an if statement, so it's going to bounce back up when it hits the bottom, essentially. Okay. All right. So I am going to start again from scratch. And the only thing I'm going to do is keep my setup. And the only thing that's going to be different in here is that I am going to add a rect mode and set that equal to center. And I'm going to keep the background in draw. So we are only going to see one frame at a time. Okay. Okay. So the first thing we want to do is let's just draw our rectangle. And we're going to do width divided by 2 for the x, so it's going to be drawn in the center. We're going to use the y variable. Oh, sorry. We need to create our variables at the top, don't we? My bad. So let's create a variable for s, which is going to be size, and let's set that to be 100. Let's create a variable for y, which is going to be s divided by 2. And so that's basically the same thing that we did for the circle, since we're doing rect mode center. So instead of doing 0, we have to do s divided by 2. And then variable for speed, set that equal to 5. And a variable for gravity, set that equal to, and for now just 0.2. We could play around with the actual number here later. Okay, so back to our rect. So we did width divided by 2 for the x. We're using the y variable at the top for the y. And then for the size, we're just going to do s and s. Let's create a fill as well, so we can actually see this when we run it. Just going to do, let's try 0. Okay, cool. So we have a rectangle at the top. That's black. Okay, so now we need to update the position, right? We need to move this down. So let's do y equals y plus speed. Let's run that. All right, great. So it's going from the top down. But again, it's just continuously going all the way down. So we need to change that. Let's add an if statement here. So if y is greater than height minus s divided by 2, then we're going to change the direction. So let's do speed equals speed times negative. Let's do 1 for now, and we'll update that later when we play around with gravity. Okay, great. So we only care about bouncing from the bottom right now. Bouncing from the top doesn't really matter because we're going to be changing the gravity, and that's going to gradually get slower and lower as the sketch goes on. But we need to add the gravity first. So to do that, we're going to change the speed to be equal to speed plus gravity. Okay. All right, so we got the gravity, so it's bouncing. It's gradually going slower and getting lower, getting lower, getting lower. Cool. So what you can also do is, instead of doing -1, we could do like -0.95. So it'll slow it down a little bit faster. So it's just going to gradually bounce and bounce and bounce until it stops bouncing. Sometimes it gets a little stuck, but it looks like it's doing all right. Yeah, and then it kind of sinks. Not sure why. Okay, cool. And that is gravity. Okay, so we got our gravity on our rectangle, so it's gradually falling down and getting lower and lower and lower and going slower and slower and slower. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is play around with both X and Y movements. So rather than just going from left to right or top to bottom, we can go at a diagonal and kind of bounce all around the top, bottom, left, and right. So we have our variables at the top. We have d for the diameter of our, in this case, ellipse. We have a variable for x and y for the positions, and then an x speed and a y speed for the speed that we're going to go on the x axis and the speed we're going to go on the y axis. Also in here, we are going to define a random location for x and y from the start. And then we're also going to find x speed to be equal to, in this case, 2, and y speed 3 within our setup. So we are creating the variables at the top, but inside of setup, we're going to define what the value is for those variables. And then in draw, we're just going to basically draw our ellipse, apply our x, y values for the position, and then d for the size, and then we are going to update the x and y position based off of x speed, y speed, and then add a couple of if statements, so it's going to bounce off the side of the walls essentially. So it should look something like this, just bouncing all over the place. Okay, so I am going to start again, and we don't need the rec mode, so I'm going to delete that. Okay, so we kept everything. We have our setup with our create canvas, our background, stroke, and color mode. And then in our draw, we just kept the background. So it's going to be drawing a background every single time. So at the top, let's create a variable for d, which is the size of our ellipse. Let's just set it as 30 for now. Let's create a variable for x, y, x speed, and y speed. And here we're just creating those variables, but we haven't defined a value to those variables or designated a value for those variables. We are going to do that within setup, mainly because we want to use for x and y, we want to use the random function. And because that is a P5 function, we have to use that inside of the P5 setup or draw functions. So that's why we're defining x in here. And let's do a random value between d and width minus d. So this will just make sure that the ellipse is going to stay on the screen, on the canvas. And then we're going to do the same thing for y. Random value between d and height minus d. And then we can define x speed be equal to 2 and y speed equal to 3. Again, you could change what those values are if you wanted to bounce and move faster. Okay, so in draw, we're gonna just draw the ellipse. And we're just gonna use those x and y variables that we used for the position, and then the d variable for the width and height. And then let's add a fill so we could see something. Okay, let's just play it, see what happens. Okay, cool. So we are getting a randomly positioned ellipse somewhere on the canvas. Great, so that's working, but it's not moving. So to move it, we have to update the x and y values. So x equals x plus x speed, and y equals y plus y speed. Okay, so let's play that. Okay, great. So we have a ellipse being drawn in a random location and then moving in a random location as well. Or I guess that's not random since x speed and y speed are defined. So it's moving in a diagonal location to the right and down. But as you can see, it's just continuously going off the canvas. So it's just gonna go off the canvas forever until we stop it and play it again, or if we add a couple if statements. So let's do the latter. So we're gonna add an if statement for both the x and y. I'm gonna do the shorthand too. So it doesn't go completely off the screen on the bottom. So let's do x first. So let's say when x is greater than width minus d divided by 2, or when x is less than d divided by 2, what do we want to do? We basically want to change the position of, in this case, x speed. So x speed equals x speed times -1. And then we want to do this for y as well. Okay. So y is greater than height minus d divided by 2, or y is less than d divided by 2. And then again, if that's the case, then we want to update the y speed to go in the opposite direction. So we have to set y speed equal to y speed minus 1. Okay, I'm just gonna make this a little bigger. Okay. And let's hit play, and I should bounce off of all sides and never leave the canvas. Huzzah! It works. Okay, cool. We're getting somewhere. All right, let's stop this. All right, so we have moved a ellipse on both the x and y axis. So it's moving at a diagonal and it's bouncing off the top, bottom, left, and right sides. So we did this for one, but what if we wanted to do this for many? So the best way to do this for multiple objects is to create a specific class for that object. So in this case, we're going to create our own circle class. And to do that, we are going to, in P5, we're going to create it as a function. And if you're creating, instead of a custom function, if you're creating a custom class, the industry standard is to do a initial cap for the name of that class. So that's why this is a capital C here for circle. And then inside of that class, we can pass in a couple variables. So we're going to pass in an X location, a Y location, a radius. That should probably be diameter, but that's fine. We can keep it as R. C for color, and then an X speed and a Y speed. Inside of that class, we have two methods or functions. One is draw circle, which is just going to draw the ellipse. And the other is move circle, which is going to do any sort of movement that we want it to do. In this case, we're just going to have it bounce off all sides, just like what we did a second ago. Cool. So let's set that up first, and then we can talk about how we use that function. Okay, so I am going to delete all this again, clean it up. And let's just start from scratch. Okay, so I'm going to add this new class at the bottom. It doesn't really matter where you put it. So function circle. So this looks very similar to like function draw and function setup. This is just creating our own class. Use the function terminology to define it. Then again, we want to use a capital initial cap for our classes. If this was just a function, then it would be a lowercase as well. And then we could pass in our values that we want to use. So we want to pass in an X value, a Y value, R for, okay, that's going to bother me. So let's just do D for diameter, and then a C for color, then X speed, and Y speed. Great. So in this class, we are going to create a few methods or functions. So to define a method inside of a class, you reference this and do this dot and then give it a name. In this case, we're going to do draw circle for the first one. And set that equal to function. And then inside of this method, we're going to pass in our color. It's for C. So we are using HSB, so I'm going to just do C 100, 100. And the C is basically just going to be our hue value. And then we're going to draw the ellipse using the X, the Y for location that we defined up here, and then D and D for diameter, which is just the size, the width and height of the ellipse. So the next thing we want to do is create another method. Let's call this move circle equals function. And then we are going to do the same thing that we did before. We're going to update our X, be X plus X speed. Update our Y to be Y plus Y speed. And then, of course, we have to have our if statements. To make sure that it bounces off the sides and tops and bottom. So if X is less than width divided by 2, if X is greater than width minus D divided by 2, or if X is less than D divided by 2, then we want to change the X speed to be equal to x speed times -1. Again, this is just reversing the course of the ellipse on the x value. Then we also obviously need to do the same thing for y. Otherwise, we'll just bounce off the sides, but not the top and bottom. Height minus d divided by 2, or y is less than d divided by 2. Oops. Then update y speed. If I could spell, that'd be great. Equals y speed speed times -1. Oops, I made a mistake on x speed. That should be x speed, not just speed. Y speed. Okay, that looks good to me. Just gonna play it. Just out of habit, it's good to play it. Okay, great. So now that we've created the class, the circle class, then we could use it. So to use it, we are basically going to create an array of circles, an empty array of circles. In this case, at the top, we're saying, okay, var circle equals new array 40. That's creating an empty array with 40 places in it. So we could have 40 circles being pushed into that array. Then in setup, we are going to create a for loop and loop through the length of this array, which we've defined as 40. And then we're going to create a random circle with random positioning and random speed and random color and random everything. And push that randomly generated circle into this circle array. Then, once we have all those circles created and stored in that array, we are going to reference those circles in that array in the draw loop with another for loop, and we're just basically going to loop through all those circles in the array and draw them and then move them using the class that we created. Cool. So let's try that. Okay, so at the top, we have to create our empty array for circles. Let's call it circles with an S, so it's not the same name as our class. So circles equals new array, and then we can say however many circles we want to have in here. We just change that number. So right now we have defined it as 40, but we could change that to 100 or 1,000 or whatever number that that you want to add in there. Okay, now in our setup, actually let's first create a couple variables for our random D. So random diameter, random X for a random X location, and a random Y for a random Y location. Okay, now in setup, we're going to do a for loop. And then we're going to loop through. We're going to loop through, create a variable, I equals 0. Then we're going to loop through the total number of spaces we have in this array, so the length of this array. So circles dot length, and then I plus plus to go on to the next. So we're going to create a random R value random D for the diameter. random, let's say it's between 10 and 100. Let's do a random value for x. And this is just initializing the random size and the random location for these balls. Random, sorry, this is speed. So this is random x speed. Let's do -5 and 5. And then a random y equals random. Again, this is y speed. Let's do the same thing, -5 and 5. Okay. And now we are going to create our circles. And when you are creating, when you're using a class, and creating a new object from that class, you have to set it to be equal to new, and then reference the name of that class that we created. In this case, it's called circle. So we're creating a new circle based off of that class that we created. So in there, let's pass in a width. So everything is going to be starting from the center point, width divided by 2, and height divided by 2. And then the next thing is the diameter, so we want to pass in the random d. The color, we could do a random value for that as well. Let's just do random. Again, that's going to be between 0 and 365. 365. Because we're just changing the hue. And then for our speed, we're going to be using the random x speed that we'd find and random y speed here. Okay, let's just play it, make sure it's working. Let's see, no errors, that's good. Okay, cool. Okay, so now everything should be being pushed into this array here and stored there, and now we can use it in draw. So in draw, we basically just want to loop through that array of circles that we created. So var for loop, and then var I equals 0. I is less than circles dot length I plus plus. So this is looping through that array at the top again. And then we are just going to draw each circle referencing each one individually using the I to pull out that particular one in the array. And draw circle, and then we also have to move it. Well, let's actually just draw it first and see what happens. Okay, cool. So we draw it, but it's not being moved. It's just being drawn in the center point. So if we wanted to move it, then we had to reference the move method that we have in the circles class. Circles I dot move circle, and then voila, we have a bunch of circles bouncing all over the place. It's chaos. If you run it again, they should all be randomly generated from the get-go, and going at random speeds and random locations, random everything. If you wanted to not like randomize the color, for instance, or just stay within like the reds and oranges, then we could say, okay, I want a hue between 0 and, let's say, I don't know, 80. And it's just going to be reds and oranges, a little bit of yellow, and almost going towards the green hue. If you wanted to have more circles, then we just change that 40 value at the top to be, let's do 100. So we have 100 circles. If we just wanted a couple, let's say, okay, I just want to have 10. Then you just change that value to 10. And there you go. Okay, cool. So that's it for kinetic forms when it comes to how to get objects moving in P5 on your canvas using the draw function. Feel free to email me or Slack me if you guys have any questions. And yeah, the next thing I want you to work on would be playing around with all these different functions and the draw function to create your own ideally abstract clock using P5. All right, go forth and enjoy.